Welcome, everybody, to episode 49 of the long-delayed Generation Jihad podcast. We are a couple weeks behind schedule here. Not that we even have a schedule at this point, Bill. I am, of course, Tom Jocelyn, and I'm here with Bill Roggio. Bill?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we've been running FDD's Long War Journal for a very long time now. It is indeed a long war. Well, this week I think we're going to touch on a couple different topics. We'll sort of do a roundup. One of the reasons why we're behind on the podcast is we're trying to schedule content around different themes. Figure out how to have podcasts that delve into different topics, and that takes a while, unfortunately. And basically, there are other reasons too. Bill, you were in Denver for a nice national hockey tournament, and that sounds like fun. I wish I was there.
Yeah, my girls are ice hockey players, so they made nationals. So yeah, it took up a little time. Got a little skiing in. It was a lot of fun. Also, Tom, I've been just jammed up so badly with Afghanistan. It's work. We'll get it out. We'll get it back together.
Yeah, and I'm backlogged about 10 pieces at this point from covering different stuff. It's just ridiculous. I mean, I've still got stuff from 2 weeks ago that I haven't finished writing up. So it's just backlogged with a lot of work. But we could talk a little bit about it on the podcast, which always acts like a therapy session anyway for us. So the other thing is we both got the second dose of the vaccine. That it wasn't a big deal for me, but we were going to record. I think it was a week and a half ago, and I definitely was out for about a day and a half, very tired. I think you had a less of a reaction than I did.
Just the sore arm. Right? I was good to go.
I was exhausted, man. I was asleep, and I was out for the count. My wife will tell you I went to bed before 8:30 at night, and I didn't get up until after 6:30 the next morning, which is, for me, is a very long night of sleep. So, because I usually battle, all sorts of sleep issues. So, all right, well, we're back. So here's episode 49. We're inching closer to episode 50. I think a couple episodes ago, I teased episode 50 was coming, and then we take a hiatus.
Here we are, so 49.
We'll eventually get there. We're sort of, I guess for the mathematicians out there, it's sort of like an asymptote, where you could sort of inching toward the asymptote, but you never actually get there. That's maybe what episode 50 is going to be for us. Maybe we should have an episode 49 and a half or something. I don't know. All right. So the first topic we'll delve into a little bit is how Al-Qaeda has reacted to recent events in Israel and Gaza and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Obviously, this is not, these issues, when it comes to these conflicts between Israel and Hamas and related issues, this isn't sort of in my wheelhouse. But the way I've always approached this is, of course, Al-Qaeda comments on this stuff. And Al-Qaeda's commented on Israel and agitated against Israel for years. What I always say to people about this is, Al-Qaeda likes to use Israel as a talking point in its messaging for rhetorical purposes to drum up support and drum up anger. But of course, Al-Qaeda's had very little to do with the actual conflict involving Israel and Hamas and other parties. Now that there are some small Al-Qaeda groups or Al-Qaeda link groups, I should say, that are involved. One of them is Jaish al-Umma, which claims some early rocket launches against Israel in this recent conflagration here. So there is a story there, but it's a small part of the story, I would say. But rhetorically, Al-Qaeda has always used Israel as part of its messaging, even though it doesn't have much to do with the actual conflicts. Now, when I say has always used it as part of its messaging, when I went through Al-Qaeda statements, I built a database at one point of Al-Qaeda's statements, and I just went through and categorized the different themes that are in them. And it definitely was a significant theme, was agitating against, of course, everybody knows the Zionist Crusader conspiracy that bin Laden imagined was at the heart of everything. And in some of the recent statements that we see now coming out, we see that theme, of course, reprised once again. It's been something they've always harped on for years. But, let's talk a little bit about the few statements and what I think is noteworthy about them and what isn't noteworthy. Now, first thing, there are several things I think are noteworthy, Bill. One is that you see, it certainly appears like there's a coordinated messaging campaign, right? I mean, you've got Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, didn't two groups, I think it was AQIM, and didn't they issue the same message? Or Am I
Well,
off on that? There was very similar worded messages.
Well, AQIM and JNIM issued similar messages, greetings for
that's what I got.
The holiday, but not on when it came to dealing with Israel. AQIM had its own. I'm going to get to AQIM statement in a second. They had a 2-page statement, which I think is probably the most interesting statement that's been released on all this. I think, but you definitely see some coordinated messaging. You see, I think anyway, I think you see it with Al-Qaeda senior leadership, then AQIM, which, by the way, may include some Al-Qaeda senior leaders. Then you see it also with, some parties out of Syria, including Samuel Aradi, who's a senior Sharia official and cleric, and Hurs al-Din, that seem to be, dealing with some of these issues as well. Obviously, his statement, his video. And you see it with AQAP. You see, I think there's definitely some coordinated messaging here across the board, which again speaks to at least some form of media cohesion as this all comes out. Now, Bill, one of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership message came in the form, the first one anyway, came in the form of the Al-Nafir bulletin. Now, I love that this thing pops up online on these social media channels, because anybody who's been following Al-Qaeda media knows the Al-Nafir comes and goes, right? It's like on edition 34. It's sort of like the Generation Jihad podcast of the Al-Qaeda world, because they have like these long delays in producing them, and they're inexplicable, right? So all of a sudden Al-Nafir comes up and they have the 34th edition of it. This I haven't seen it on Al-Nafir. I don't know when the last time I saw it on Al-Nafir was. It definitely comes and goes. This is the 34th edition of it. And that, the content of that wasn't really all that interesting. It was just basically a reprisal of bin Laden's greatest hits when it comes to the Palestinian cause. It's sort of repeating the common, your blood is our blood motto that they use in their propaganda all the time. It's a rhetorical tool that Al-Qaeda uses. So other than the fact that Al-Nafir resurfaced again after all these months, and I always kind of imagine, like, what's the Al-Qaeda production meeting for Al-Nafir? Is it?
It's certainly worth something of its own. I've always wondered why do they even need that when they have Al-Sahab and other outlets that produce more common.
Well, it's put out by Al-Sahab, but the point is, like, why even have this branded bulletin at this point? I don't get it. The Al-Qaeda media operation is always, obviously their people have been taken out of the game for years, but there is some continuity at the senior levels there too. We know that Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi, for example, Zawahiri's son-in-law, presumably is still running Al-Sahab and has run it for many years now. He's, the State Department describes him as the longtime director of it. I would assume he has a support staff, obviously, and I assume there are other people. What's going on there at those production meetings? It's probably... I kind of get the sense that it's sort of, there's definitely a little bit of the same vibe going on with our podcast. Basically, whoops, we didn't do anything with Al-Nafir for a couple months, and all of a sudden
we're going to boost that now. It's before it loses relevance.
Yeah, and who decides that the message has to go in an Al-Nafir, right? So it's just a 2-page PDF bulletin that pops up online. I found it on Telegram and briefly on Twitter before a couple accounts that were brought down. I also found it on one of the many websites I found it on Riot. One of the other websites I had to follow is Chirpwire, which, good Lord. There are all these different social media sites that these bastards are using to proliferate their messaging, and then we have to go follow them all, and it just takes up a lot of time. So anyway, Al-Nafir resurfaced. It's out. The statement, again, it's not really all that interesting. Statement just reprises bin Laden's greatest hits. Now, the AQIM statement, which you mentioned, Bill, that one's a lot more interesting to me because that one, in that case, AQIM really lays into Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority president, describing him as a secular traitor. That's a quote from the statement that we translated. And, basically accuses the Palestinian Authority of being in cahoots with the Israeli government. And that statement AQM also lays into all of the Arab regimes that they have normalized relations with Israel. And they have a long message, a long line, a passage in there where they say the road to Jerusalem lies through, and they go through all these Arab capitals and Tehran. So they're saying, basically all these different governments, are our enemies. And they definitely encourage fighting against and jihad against all these different regimes. And Bill, what got me about this was a point that you and I have discussed a long time. some people would look at that and say, well, they're changing, Al Qaeda's changing course, and they're just focusing on the local, the near enemy now. They didn't do that in the past. And this is so ignorant. I mean, it's just a complete misreading of the history of Al Qaeda. If you go back to the history of Al Qaeda, you can go 9/11 Commission report. Going right back to the 1990s, they supported various local causes, so-called local causes against near enemies. It's never been, that's never been something they've never been out of that business, And you could build a whole history going right up through present day. If you look at the guidelines that Zawahiri and Al Qaeda senior leadership issued in 2013, the general guidelines for jihad, some people seized upon the early passages that talk about the primacy of America as an enemy for Al Qaeda and the jihadists, which is true. That language is there, and some of that language is in the AQAM statement. But then they have all these carve outs, and they say, but all these other foes are foes we're fighting, and we have to fight. And they identify governments and actors in Africa and across the Middle East, and all the way, of course, into Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan. So this idea that there's this hard line between near and far enemy for Al Qaeda, I just think that's a false dichotomy. It's true that Al Qaeda went after the far enemy in ways that meaning America, in ways that other jihadi parties didn't. That's true, but that doesn't mean they weren't interested in the fight against the near enemies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's insane that almost 20 years after 9/11 that we have to have this discussion. The near and the far enemy are equally important. The reason Al Qaeda wants attacks the U.S. is to drive us out of the Middle East so they can attack the local regimes. They believe the United States is responsible for keeping these regimes afloat. So, yeah, it's Tom, we say it's a therapy session. It's like arguing, was Al Qaeda in Iraq part of Al Qaeda's overall structure? And, I'm just so tired of having to make these arguments. It's very clear. You watch what they're doing. You read what they're saying. You could see the strategy. You could see what their objectives of Al Qaeda is. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to put all this together. And yet, you have people that want to just say Al Qaeda only cares about the near enemy, or Al Qaeda only cares about conducting terrorist attacks on the United States because they're just terrorists and that's all they want to do. It's far more complex than that, and it's why we're losing this war, because our leadership has taken very simplistic views of what Al Qaeda is and what it expects, what it wants to do, what its objectives are. And that's why we're here where we are today, and that's why you and I have to record this podcast and try and explain things that should be very obvious to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you talked about driving America out of the Middle East, I think that Al Qaeda always had two competing and even contradictory theories of that. One was the Lebanon theory of 1983, where, if we hit America hard enough, they'll withdraw from all these places, and that will free up the space for their jihadi political revolution to overthrow these near enemy regimes. That was one theory of the case that they had. But then when that didn't happen following 2001, the other theory that the case that they went with was we're going to draw them into these insurgencies and bleed them dry. And that one, I think, has been more fruitful for them, obviously, especially when you look at a war like Afghanistan, which has been horribly mismanaged for many years now. And you mentioned why we're losing this war, I mean, the broader war against the jihadists. I think what I would say is, I think it's been the case for a while that America has been trying to pivot away from a war structure entirely, from the idea and basically get to a point where the U.S. is sort of managing terrorist threats at the periphery, and we'll see how that goes. I think that's basically where we're at now. And that's been the drive for a long time, and explains, I think, the ambivalence and the problems we've had in a number of different places.
Yeah, and so Tom, on your point, absolutely right. So we're talking the difference in its objectives versus how it's going to achieve those objectives, right?
Sure.
So it thought that its objective is drive the U.S. out of the Middle East. Well, how are they going to do it? A major attack would make the U.S. crumble. That didn't happen. So it changed its strategy and says, okay, then let's draw them into insurgencies. Let's bleed them dry. But the objective of driving the U.S. from the Middle East has always been the same. And that's what, they're doing it in different forms and taking different strategy. That's what people fail to understand. They confuse objectives with tactics and strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have a big bugaboo with the word strategy in U.S. policy circles, but
yeah.
I won't go off on that now because I think a lot of times people use strategy in foreign policy circles because they basically want to say something is X is not strategic for America to do, and so therefore we shouldn't do it. And it's all confirmation bias a lot of times, it's all circular reasoning. But let's go back to the AQIM statement here, where. I'll go back to that point at some point in the future, but let's get back to the AQIM statement here. What I thought was very interesting about it was just how much onus AQIM puts on the so-called secular traders. These are the parties that have supposedly befriended or normalized relations with Israel, and it's referred to just as the Jews in AQIM statement. I think the on the fear bulletin had a more anti-Semitic smear even for the Jews, talking about them as I think something like the brothers of the monkeys and pigs. I mean, it's a pretty anti-Semitic line, which shows you that, Al-Qaeda always has while they're trying to capitalize on the policy and the disputes here and all this stuff, they have deeply anti-Semitic views of all this, of course, and that informs everything that they put out. But back to the AQIM statement, they even cast doubt on the statement even cast doubt on the efficacy of fighting the Jews, as the way they put it, basically saying that this won't work unless the jihadis go after those who have befriended the Jews and put them in the same category. And even to the point of saying that basically fighting the traitors, the way AQIM calls them, should even take priority over fighting the Jewish infidels at times. That's what the statement says. I think that's very interesting because it's again, back to the near enemy, far enemy stuff. This is basically saying, yeah, the quote unquote Jews at the heart of the Zionist Crusader conspiracy, but they're all in on it. We got to go after all of them. We have to go after these other parties. Almost saying we have to go after these other parties, or is saying we have to go after these other parties first because we can't actually defeat the Jews unless we clear out these people who are standing in the way. And I think that is an interesting and noteworthy line, though.
Yeah, Tom, it's all about unity, right? You're not going to win the war until you're unified. So they're saying until our house is in order, until we get all on the same page, we're not. There's a religious aspect to it as well, right? We're not going to get the approval from Allah to win our jihad until we're doing it the way that we believe it needs to be done, the way that the Quran says it needs to be done. So that's where they're going with this. It's it reminds me a lot of the criticisms of during the so-called Arab Spring with Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, right? When Al-Qaeda came and said, you think you're going to gain power, but none of this is going to happen until you do this properly. You can't use Western methods to try to win this war. You can't use elections. And I think that's part of the criticism that they have with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and things of that nature. Not a perfect analogy there, but it just, a lot of the messaging does remind me of the same criticisms from way back when, where, you got to fight, you got to wage jihad Al-Qaeda's way. And that is the path to victory. All of this other stuff leaves us divided, and it's not approved by Allah.
Yeah, which, I think we'll move on from these statements, but I'll probably have more to say about some of them in the future. But, you're talking about the path to victory, and I think that opens up the next topic, actually, because one of the problems they have, and you've seen this in their discourse, is that they haven't achieved victory anywhere, right, after all this time. They keep saying this is the only way we're going to win, is if we do it Al-Qaeda's way, which is supposedly Allah's way. And of course, this is a particular interpretation of all that. That's not shared by most Muslims, of course. Right. But the bottom line is that they claim that they have the path to victory, and yet they haven't achieved victory anywhere after all these years, and have suffered a number of battlefield losses in terms of building their Islamic Emirates. But there's potentially a big exception on the horizon, isn't there? We now are closer to a victory in a place that matters much more to them than now it matters to America, and that is Afghanistan. And we always tease each other about having to talk about Afghanistan on the podcast because obviously it's something you and I have talked about for so long now, and we have so many of the same points. But what I thought was interesting was you recently, one of the reasons why this podcast has been delayed is you were working on updating your analysis, Bill, of what the battlefield situation looks like in Afghanistan. You've maintained this map, and it's an estimate. I should stress this is an estimate of what the Taliban and Al Qaeda, its other jihadi allies, the districts that they contest and control in Afghanistan. Now, they obviously contest far more districts than they actually control. However, or estimated to have controlled. This is an estimate. This is something that takes a lot of analysis on your part to put together to figure it out. And I know you update it constantly when you find something wrong or you find something new or whatever. You're constantly working on it. But why don't you give us the punchline of what your estimate says? Because it sure looks like they're closer to victory now in Afghanistan than they've been anywhere in a long time.
Sure. And I'm going to give just a little, I don't know if we've ever done this on the podcast, but just a little background on the map. And, look, we look at districts. A lot of these districts that are contested, I could probably easily call them controlled. Some of the ones that are controlled probably could move into contested category. The reality is that this information
and when
you
talk about contested control, you're talking about whether or not the Afghan government, which has been stood up by the U.S. at this point, whether or not they actually maintain control of the district, or whether or not the Taliban and Al Qaeda control the district. And then, of course, back in the days, ISIS, their branch, had controlled 10 districts in Nangarhar.
Right? Like yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So it was a small. But anyway, the heart of the action really is whether or not the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and their allies control or contest the district, or the Afghan government does. Right.
And I don't think there's any doubt about the contested category. Right. So any of these. So here it is. Right. Here what I came up with. There's 407 districts in Afghanistan. Think of them as counties in the United States, right? So of those, there are, okay, let me take you back. January 2018, that was when Resolute, they tried to shut down the supporting of the districts, the reporting on the districts. They did so several months later. I estimated the Taliban controlled 45 districts and about 11% of the districts, contested another 117. That's about 29%. So we're looking at about 40% of Afghanistan's districts, either contested or controlled. And by the way, most of the fighting takes place in the districts that are contested. And often the government's position in these districts that are contested is very, very tenuous. Fast forward to today, we have 87 of the districts that I have estimated that are controlled by the Taliban. That's about 21%. And there are 214 that are contested. That's about 53%. So we're looking at 74% of the districts. Now, so back when I started this before Resolute Support actually did this. They actually contacted me, I want to say I started in 2014. It was just very limited information. They contacted me around 15, 16 and asked me about it, which I thought was odd. And I asked them, my question to them was, why aren't you tracking this? I mean, you're sending people out in the districts and you don't even know what's going on. But then they started providing an information to SIGAR, the Special Investigator General for Afghan Reconstruction. They started producing the map. And my data was always about 10 to 15% off. My picture was always a little darker, but I could prove how Resolute Support was fudging the data. They were in order to make things look a lot rosier. So even the best case scenario that Resolute Support was providing was only about 10% off of my data. So when they shut it down,
so very comparable. Even though there's a discrepancy there,
absolutely,
it's not like this is it's not like your map was out of left field or completely different ball game from what they were showing. Yeah. I mean, it's just basically, it's at the margins, whether or not some of these districts, how you categorize.
Yeah. And what they were doing too, I have contested, government controlled, Taliban controlled. And they changed it actually because they didn't like the wording. They had like government controlled, government influenced, contested, Taliban influenced, Taliban controlled. I always looked at that as a district's either contested or controlled, right? They're trying to.
How do you influence a district without controlling it, right? I mean, right. Either you control a security situation or you don't.
Yeah, that was always my view on this. So where something was controlled, and look, I was able to prove this, and particularly they wouldn't release the data, the full data. Eventually, I was able to get the information, but before they started releasing me the information, I knew what they were doing. So if a district was Taliban, I knew it was Taliban controlled. It would show as or Taliban influence. And so once they released the data on Helmand, and everyone knows what the security, anyone who pays partial attention to what's going on in Helmand province knows the Taliban routinely controls 7 to 8 districts, contests the rest, basically, other than one district, right? And they only claimed like 2 to 4 were Taliban controlled, and they were really softballing the data. So I always thought,
that's Taliban country. I mean, it's not, this is
and so
right.
that's why I knew I had a high degree of confidence that it was. But again, and I want to be very clear, this is more of an art than a science. I have to sweep up information. A lot of these districts we don't get any reporting on. So if I do see reporting on it, I'll update it, but I have to go through and sweep 407 districts every couple of months. The ones that I see in the news, the ones that I'm looking at, that comes in. But every once in a while, I just got to go back through and sweep up 407. But what we just saw, we'll get back to the information, back to the punchline, as you said, with the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, with the U.S. launching airstrikes against the Taliban, at times to prevent them from overrunning provincial capitals. And that's all that U.S. air power has really done. The Taliban basically doubled the number of districts it controls and basically doubled the number of districts contested over the last 3 years. And if we think that this security situation is going to improve when the U.S. when the U.S. withdrawal is complete, look, the data doesn't tell me that. Looking at how the Afghan military has fought and how it's lost ground to the Taliban, even with the U.S. there, I think things look very grim. I'm currently working on an analysis of what I think the Taliban offensive is going to look like. I needed to complete this map before I get to that, so that's probably becoming. Actually, it will be coming next week. It's on my desk. I just needed to get the numbers together, get the full picture, and to summarize that really quick, you're going to probably see the Taliban quickly take control of the south, come up through the east, and then that fight for the capital is going to begin. Time frame on that, a lot of variables, but we'll see how that goes. But that's for a future podcast.
All right, so there's several. So before you say it's a future podcast, one of the things that I would love for you to do on one of these podcasts is walk through this, because your analysis. A lot of times you'll say something to me, and I'll be like, "Man, write that," because. Right, because in like 2 months later, it'll be turn out to be exactly what they did or what was coming, and that's obviously you're my friend, so obviously but I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, like me, I'm a nerd who tracks this stuff.
One thing about Tom, you have to understand about Tom and I, our circles are small because we do not blow smoke. We are not the kind of people who tolerate fools, and it's a blessing and a curse in this business. I view it as a blessing because it keeps us honest. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, there've been a lot of fools commenting on the Afghan war too. I mean, it's part of the problem here. I mean, but you talk about the data. There's several things to build on here. What you're talking about. So the first thing is you talk about the data that the military was accumulating on it, and they were putting out a version of it through SIGAR, and I think the Inspector General, maybe the Office of the Inspector General at DoD. In any event, they were putting out a version of this, and then they stopped, right? Now, this is one of the ways that Bill and I have been critical about the U.S. leadership and performance when it comes to the war in Afghanistan. This is not a metric that you and I were alone, or you were alone in saying matters. This is an obvious thing that matters, is how much territory the Taliban contests or controls, along with their jihadi allies. Of course that matters. But the U.S. military itself said that this is the metric that matters in terms of, it was General Nicholson, I believe, or you point to other generals too, who said this mattered. This was the metric that matters. So they say, the U.S. military leadership does say this matters, and this is how we're judging the success of the war effort. Oops, it's not going their way. It doesn't look good. And so what do? They classify the data, or they stop releasing the data. They bury the data.
And they told us that the real measure of success
here you go.
is reconciliation between the Afghan government
and the progress of political settlement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And this is where the delusion then sets in, right? This is where this is the last delusion, in my view, of the war in Afghanistan.
Tom, can I make one comment before you go there? And sure. It's back to, I mentioned this briefly. So at this time, when they cut this off, they're telling us it doesn't matter what happens in the districts, while they're still sending U.S. aid workers in the districts. U.S. Special Operations Forces go there. So they're to have us believe that it doesn't matter what's happening out there, just from the standpoint that because they told us we're not gathering this data and releasing this data anymore. So just from a tactical point of view, the message they're putting out there is that we don't care what's happening out in the provinces and the districts, because all we care about is reconciliation. And meanwhile, in 2019, they didn't cut anything off then. So I just always found that to be just frustrating and horrifying. But go ahead, Tom. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to.
Well, look. I mean, I hope that, if there are any junior officers out there listening to this, and you're going to do a postmortem on the war in Afghanistan, what went wrong, because there's going to be a lot of commentary and a lot of analysis on that in the years to come. I hope that people that listen to this podcast, I hope you are critical of the U.S. military leadership. Right? This is an example where, and we have multiple examples of this, where they say, "Here's the standard for success." Whoops, the standard for success isn't looking so good. So we're going to classify or suppress the data that we're using to measure that, and we're going to change to another standard, right? And so they say, well, the standard is, how much ground we can keep out of the jihadis' control. That doesn't look so good. We're not going to talk about that anymore, and we're going to move on to this fanciful political settlement and pretend that the Taliban is really fighting for leverage in these fanciful negotiations as opposed to fighting for victory, which is what they've been fighting for all along. And so this is poor leadership, right? This is a leadership failure. And where Bill and I are, I think, very frustrated with all this is there's never any accountability, right? If you're in the business world, not all the times, as we saw after the subprime mortgage crisis, unfortunately, right. But a lot of times in the business world, if you take a business strategy and you pursue it and you're in the marketplace and you're competing in the marketplace, and you're competing in the stock market and you're competing for investment dollars and you're competing for profits, and the strategy you pick fails, well, you're out, right? You have to, you're going to need new leaders. Board of directors can shareholders can vote to replace management. There are competitive mechanisms to account for failure, right? And to correct course. And here's the problem. There are no competitive measures to account for failure when it comes to this stuff, right? And these things. And that's a problem, in my view. That's a huge problem, because you say this is the metric for success. You fail to achieve that metric for success, so you just change the metric. And that's not acceptable to me. It shouldn't be acceptable to Americans. And part of why we understand the frustration, for example, with the war in Afghanistan is because of this stuff, right? I mean, what are you supporting if you're supporting that, right? It doesn't make any sense.
How do I argue for a continued presence when we've had failed leadership, incompetent leadership, and leadership that has deceived us, has lied to us, frankly? Well,
I mean, what I would say about that is I don't know if they're just lying to us or lying to themselves, and lying to us. To me, whether or not they're actively know the truth and are covering it up or not is almost sort of secondary to the point that they're just incompetent.
Yeah,
right?
Tom, this issue, though, because the reason they started producing this data is because they thought it was going to show that the Taliban lost ground and that less of the Afghan population, because remember, the population control is big on this too.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I want to explain why these numbers probably are worse than what show on the website. They thought that was going to show improvement. And what it did was it showed a 1 to 3% decrease every quarter. So that doesn't seem like much, but over
slow bleed.
You just saw what 1 to 3% looks like over the course of 3 years.
Over the course, or if it's every quarter, I mean, over the course of a year, looking at 10% potentially.
That's right, and then start doing that over 3 years. This is why you got 20%. This is why you got 50. Now, obviously, there could be spurts, right, and whatnot. But this is how we got them to double the control in contested districts, because it was looking bad. They knew it. They canceled it for that reason. And so look, on some of the things, do I know that General so-and-so knows that there's more than 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda? Maybe they're getting bad information perking up. Maybe they just, I don't expect them to be complete experts. But on this issue, we know why General Miller canceled this, because it made everything look bad.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. What I was trying to make the general point that they don't have to lie about everything to be incompetent.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The point is that the overall picture here is one of incompetence and not being a straight shooter with what's coming on and not getting it right. And this is what I would say for future. Listen, I'm just a nerd, so who am I? So don't listen to me. I don't care. But if you're in the military and you want to make things better in the future, and you're a junior officer, you need to deal with this, right? You need to deal with the fact that this leadership is rotten. And, there are a lot of people who hate you and me because we say stuff like this, Bill. I don't really care, as you know. these guys have gotten this wrong for so long now and wasted so many lives and so much money, and there needs to be some sort of accountability going forward. And I don't think there ever will be. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and we're not talking people's bank accounts getting depleted by 20%. We're talking about people losing limbs or dying for this type of incompetence, and that's what I find utterly and totally. If it was just a matter of we're losing profit or some money went down the drain, I might be able to just go, But no, we're talking lives here. It's the same thing with like letting Pakistan get away with what it got away with over the course of years, right? And that cost American lives in Afghanistan, and you junior officers
and Afghan lives and all sorts. I mean, it just kept it just doesn't make any sense. But look now on the flip side, one of the benefits of the ongoing American presence, one of the things they've gotten so-called right, and I want you to give the nuanced explanation of this is it's true, and some people keep pointing to this as if it's sort of the only thing that matters, that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda haven't controlled any provincial capitals as long as the U.S. and NATO are there. That's true. The U.S. and NATO, the forces have basically prevented them from taking and holding, and really underline the holding part, right, the provincial capitals. And, they've obviously taken temporary control of several of them. Farah, Ghazni, and Kunduz come to mind immediately. But they're, in other places they have gotten stronger as well and muscled up at times as well. But the problem is that they know that they basically, our reading of that is they didn't want to expend the manpower to hold these provincial capitals while we're there with superior special operations capabilities and superior air superiority. Now that the U.S. and NATO goes out, they've basically built the noose around a number of these provincial capitals, and now they're just going to go in for the kill, right, Bill? I mean, that's basically the problem with anybody who says, well, Afghanistan is different. After all these years, they don't control any provincial capitals. Yeah, but that was contingent on the U.S. and NATO having forces there. Now that the U.S. and NATO will not have forces there, guess what? That's going to change.
Yeah, Tom, you're absolutely, you do. I like your put the noose around the neck. That's what they've done to the provincial capitals here. I estimate that there's 16 of the 34 provincial capitals are under direct threat from the Taliban. Now, can the Taliban take all 16 at the same time? No, I don't think they're capable of doing, particularly while the U.S. is not there. So this is this is another thing, by the way, that the generals, in Afghanistan have misled the American public because they know what they have this map. They know what the Taliban was doing. They're following a classic rural insurgency strategy of taking all these districts that are Taliban controlled are all rural, small population.
Yeah, but and as you just said, this is the classic insurgency tactic. This is not like listen, I'm not an expert in military strategy whatsoever,
Tom. Yeah.
No, this is not exactly, but this isn't exactly, you don't need to read 3 textbooks to figure this out, right? I mean, this is something everybody knows what they're doing, or you should know what they're doing.
I mean, look, I could write this strategy on the back of an envelope. Anyone who has, a cursory understanding of guerrilla strategy understands what the Taliban, this map shows what the Taliban is doing. And that's what they've done. Tom, you put it perfectly. They put the noose around the neck of these provincial capitals. And this is where the Taliban trains. This is where they recruit, training centers. They're running mines. I just read an article about how I think they control hundreds of mineral mines, including gold mines and gems, coal mines. They're making millions and millions of dollars off of these. Of course, there's the opium. Then they collect tax cattle and crops and all of these things that the Taliban is doing. And yet this was downplayed by U.S. military commanders who knew exactly what was happening. The Taliban, as you said, they're not going to expend the energy to take these capitals when I think
and hold them. It's mainly the hold them. Yeah.
I think the Taliban, people will say, well, they tried in Kunduz twice, and they did it in Farah and Ghazni City, which, by the way, they took the center of each of those capitals and laid waste. I think those were more the Taliban showing the Afghan people what they can do while the Americans were still there. Some of this, I don't like the messaging, everyone trying, this is a message. I think the Taliban, look, they took a shot. They said, hey, maybe we can hold these. But at the very least, at the very worst, because a lot of these attacks, what they do is just instill fear and keep Afghans on the fence or get them to defect. Those were dry runs. The Taliban was finding out what they could do while the U.S. was there, and now they know what they could do we're going to find out what they can do when the U.S. is gone. And I think that again, I think we're going to see, look, there's no way the Afghan security forces, if they want to remain cohesive and if they want to control areas in the center and in the north, and the north looks particularly bad. And, I actually did a TV interview with a former advisor with President Ghani and President Karzai. He absolutely agreed that he said the Afghan government is going to have to abandon large areas in the south and the east if it wants to control the center and retake these areas in the north where it's more capable. So this isn't just coming from me. So Afghans who are in the know, who understand Afghanistan and the political dynamics and the ethnic dynamics and where the Taliban's strong, they understand this. And so I think this is what we're going to see. It's a very bleak picture. It's going to be a return of the Taliban, the return of the Islamic Emirate, and the return of Al-Qaeda.
Well, Al-Qaeda's been there the whole time.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm sorry. Return of the Islamic Emirate and the resurgence of Al-Qaeda, I think is.
Well, I would say the way I put it is the announced presence of Al-Qaeda. Yeah. They've been doing it in Thabat, the Arabic publication, the newsletter, which is actually much more substantive than on the Fear, which we discussed earlier. They've been talking about this all the time. I've got some stuff I've been pulling from those, and you pulled from those as well. Some maps of Afghanistan, that kind of thing. They're there the whole time. I mean, it's just this is again one of the leadership failures here across the board, was not being able to even give an accurate assessment of what Al-Qaeda looked like in Afghanistan after all these years. I mean, it's pathetic. But when you talk about what the Afghan government's doing, I saw an interview on Spiegel with Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, in which he was saying, there was ambiguity over the last couple of years about whether America was staying or going, and that basically caused problems for them in terms of how they were going to go about warfighting. And I thought, man, oh man, look, I'm not looking to rag on Ghani at this point. I think he has a tough hand. I think there's a lot of people who couldn't play that hand. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the Jihadis are ultimately responsible for the war and keeping the war going. And despite all our criticisms of the American and Afghan government side, and we have plenty of them, they're the real bad actors here that have kept everything going, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Jihadis. But Ghani's interview was just so clueless to me. I mean, if you didn't know that once the U.S. adopted these talks with the Taliban, which were rooted in Taliban apology and Afghan war revisionism, and said that we're going to prioritize a political settlement with the Taliban, even though there was absolutely zero evidence that the Taliban is interested in a political settlement and just wanted concessions. If you didn't know that early on, and you didn't know that as the talks began in 2018, you didn't know that by 2019, I mean, I just think that's sort of a convenient excuse, I mean, you should have known that the jig was up. We were saying since 2018, America's leaving. You don't understand. The books are cooked here. The U.S. is getting out. A lot of people didn't believe us when we said that. I mean, I had people who were, who even served in Afghanistan and thought, no, we're going to stay no matter what. And I thought, no, you don't understand. What we see from the State Department, Defense Department, and at that time, senior most levels of the Trump administration, including people we talked to, no, the U.S. was leaving. And President Biden wasn't going to reverse course on all that. So, but in that same interview, you just mentioned all the gold mines and everything that the Taliban, all the mineral mines and gold and all these different natural resources the Taliban has been scooping up and getting ready to support their emirate here financially. And in that same interview, Ashraf Ghani said, well, not all is lost in Afghanistan. There's still plenty of things to invest in. And the first thing he mentioned were pine nuts. And I just thought, oh boy, look, again, I'm not looking to rag on Ashraf Ghani. I mean, I think he's got a tough hand here, and we'll see what he does here in the coming months. I mean, he could very well be fleeing at any time from Afghanistan or go down with the fight. Who knows? But I mean, if really the number one selling point you have for the economy right now, for your economy, is pine nuts, so that's the first thing that comes to mind, yeah, you're in trouble. So anyway, this is all, I think it's all grim, dark situation here, what's coming. One other point on all this is I saw a news report where Biden administration officials were quoted anonymously saying that basically the Trump administration deal with the Taliban tied their hands. Now, look, there's a lot you could say about the merits of leaving and staying and all that in the debate. I don't want to relitigate all that here, but of all the arguments I've heard about all this, come on, right? That deal was told. We've gone on and on about that deal so many times. That deal was nonsense. That shouldn't tie anybody's hands. in any way, shape, matter, or form. I mean, just the Taliban just showed up in Doha to get their concessions. That's it. There was no. I mean, this is ridiculous, and they did nothing to satisfy the supposed counterterrorism assurances in that deal. So, look, I understand the arguments for getting out, but don't tell me that deal was why you had to get out.
Yeah, Tom, that would be like Trump saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't put aside the Iran deal because it tied my hands with the Obama administration." No. If you don't like the deal, discard it. This is just complete. They're trying.
Well, especially in this case, because the Taliban, we know the Taliban hasn't complied with its supposed. So like anybody knows in business that if you have a contract and one side isn't doing, it's totally insane to say, well, we had to get out of Afghanistan because we have this deal, even though the other party isn't doing anything to comply with the provisions in the deal. I mean, it's just totally stupid. I mean, when you have a business transaction in New York or somewhere else, anywhere in the business world, I forget New York, Silicon Valley, Washington, wherever, any place, I mean, take one of the rural areas of America. If you have two parties to a deal and one party doesn't live up to its end of the bargain, does the other party say, okay, well, I got to abide by this deal even though you're not living up to it? I mean, what are you talking about?
I think, Tom, on a simpler level, it could discard the deal if it doesn't like it. It's not like there's some court that's binding.
It's not a ratified treaty. Yeah, it's not a ratified treaty. Yeah. So, well, President Biden's argument is that America.
They had every excuse to get out of it because the Taliban wasn't involved. So if they wanted an excuse to cast it aside and do something, the reality is they just wanted out too. So they just use that as an excuse. I mean, look, how long are they going to blame Trump for foreign policy failures? I mean, we're going to hear this 20 years from now. I mean, look, I'm not a big fan of a lot of his foreign policy. Particularly, Afghanistan.
There's nothing to defend on Afghanistan,
right.
So I'm not. I mean, but the point is, like, forget about. I mean, it's just that deal in particular. Forget about Trump for a second. Just saying that deal. We had to agree to that. We had to abide by it. I mean, just to me, it's ridiculous. I mean, I'm gonna have to write about that deal again. Because it's just so. I think the absurdity of it is just. I don't think people understand how absurd that whole thing is. And again, the only thing you can point to right now is that the Taliban, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, refrained from attacking American forces since February 29th, 2020. And they were happy to do so because the U.S. was retreating. And all they did was then use that operational capacity against the Afghan government, which the U.S. government has been throwing under the bus now for quite some time. So, obviously that all looks pretty grim going forward. I would just wrap up here by saying, look, the Taliban senior leadership has released several new statements again in recent weeks. You had a couple of statements from Siraj Haqqani, the deputy emir. You had a statement by Habatullah Akhundzada. Look at those statements. They're just peppered with references to the Islamic Emirate, peppered with it. The idea that they've been fighting for something other than resurrecting the Islamic Emirate is nonsense. One of the things you and I have done for the years, Bill, is just count the times they reference Islamic Emirate in a statement. I did that keyword search for you on the Habatullah Akhundzada's, and who was the emir of the Taliban. It was at least 15 times,
I remember doing one where it was like 21 times or something. If people don't think this is what they're fighting for, I'm tired of this. Talk about being tired of something, writing up how the Taliban says it wants an Islamic Emirate. I mean, goodness, they've done it so many times. It's just, I roll my eyes when I read these statements that come out. And
yet the senior U.S. military, political, diplomatic, and military leadership has pretended that they want something other than that, right? I mean, this is, again, where it just doesn't make any damn sense. I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, when we write the book on all this, I started collecting examples of this. It gets to be redundant and repetitive so quickly.
They think the Taliban's going to participate in democracy, and here's words that Taliban has used. And I'm just going to give you a couple of them that they've used to describe democracy: un-Islamic, Satan, which is probably the worst one, right? Because everything is
in their scheme certainly is, yeah.
Satanic, demonic, right? Like then they call the Afghan government, which cooperates with the U.S., puppets. I'm forgetting all of the fun terms.
Apostate. They claim they're apostates.
Yep, right.
Yeah. I mean,
this is what they think. I mean, they're not just writing it. It's not some guy that went off the handle. And then you'll see people say, well, Voice of Jihad really isn't the official publication.
I saw there was that reporter, I think it was the Wall Street Journal reporter. Yeah. They had that where they said the Voice of Jihad doesn't really speak for the organization. Oh,
really? I mean, it only publishes statements signed by Hakanzada and Siraj Asghani, and it'll tell you it's official. It's absurd. This is the level.
This is
what we deal with, and yeah.
Well, I mean, look, again, to anybody out there who does a postmortem on this and wants to know what went wrong, you got to take a clear eye on all this. And when you start imagining your enemy, wish casting that your enemy is something other than what he is, the game's over. And that's what we realized that was going on some time ago. So
yeah, when do you think we finally caught like them when we? It's a long time, Tom, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, you and I begrudgingly supported the 2017 small bump in forces in Afghanistan. We did not support the surge, by the way, under President Obama because we thought that was doomed to fail and was going to be a waste of resources, and it was.
Oh, and by the way, I didn't support that because it was clearly cynical political move, and more troops died during that surge period.
Right.
Than at any point. Like, actually, more than half of the U.S. casualties occurred during that, and it was destined to fail, and we knew it, and that's why we couldn't support that.
They died and injured for something America's political leadership didn't really believe in. Yeah. That's why you're saying it's cynical. That's what always bothered us about that, was that they were going to surge forces in Afghanistan for something they didn't really believe in was necessary to do, and this is why you have to be very skeptical about all this stuff going forward. It was very cynical. But then we begrudgingly supported the increase, the small bump in forces in 2017, mainly because it wasn't going to be a similar type of surge with large numbers of American forces going into trying to clear and hold rural areas. We knew that this was a very different thing that was occurring in 2017. It was a very provisional sort of move to try and give one last attempt to stand up the Afghan government, and it was our sources said it's one last attempt, and then of course. That didn't even make it throughout a term of President Trump's first term. By 2018, he had pulled the carpet out from underneath that, and it was over. So, and as soon as we knew in 2017 that this was probably going to end in an American and a defeat, I would say. By 2018, we were certain of it. Yeah. Is what I would say.
I think we published an op-ed in the New York Times saying the war is lost, right, Tom?
Well. The title of it was, which we didn't choose because that's one of the things people don't get. Sometimes you get criticized.
Yeah, for the title, you don't.
But the title, and I'm like, I didn't choose the title. I mean, what can I do? But it was, "Are we losing Afghanistan again?" That was in 2015.
Wow.
So it was 2015. We knew this thing was going south a long time ago. So I mean, that's part of why we.
But back to Mike, when did we know? When did we finally kind of get the clue on the leadership? That it was just completely that this thing was not. I think it would have to be somewhere around at the surge time, right? Like we just knew that.
Let's save this for another podcast. We'll talk about all the leadership failures and all this.
Sure.
Because I just outline it for history and for anybody who wants to try and figure out what went wrong here. There's just a whole big long story here. I mean, there's so many different aspects to how this thing failed. But ultimately, at the root of it, and this is what people get mad at us for saying, and I've gotten some anger directed at me, and there's military public affairs officers who have been angry at us for years about this. I don't care. Like, there's just incompetence here that just needs to be exposed and understood. And, we can't, as Americans, you can't have this type of thing going forward here. So you just can't. Like, if we're going to salvage, how we do things in the future, it's got to recognize the errors of the past,
Absolutely. And, Tom, I'm more tolerant of just generalized and you can fix failures, mistakes, right? We all make them. I mean, some are worse than others, but there's the mistake, and then there's the intentional misreading of the situation, not intentionally misunderstanding what the Taliban's goals and objectives are, and intentionally misunderstanding Al Qaeda's presence, things of that nature, intentionally pulling the rug out on the surge, doing a surge, and doing a cynical surge is what I kind of described that. So we could be a little more tolerant. You could replace just bad leadership, but when the leadership is in on the big con, there's no way out of that. And that's where I feel the leadership has been in the U.S. military for at least 10 years now. We'll see.
On that cheery note, thank you to our listeners for listening to this episode of Generation Jihad. I was going to say this week's episode, but we're so sporadic now in terms of what weeks we release one.
We'll call it
I won't say this week.
Tom, how's that?
Yeah, we'll call it. I'm just going to say this episode. We are trying to get on a more regular schedule. Anyway. Please do subscribe to the show as sporadically as it is produced. And as a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. And we'll see you again, I was going to say next week, but, whenever.
No, we're going to do next week, Tom. I promise.
All right. I'm going to hold you to that. All right.